9210. Let's talk about, before we do the vote-only calendar as a vote, let's talk about item 9210, local government financing. Is there anyone here who can address that issue for me? This should be quick, but I have a couple of questions.
Chris Hill, Department of Finance.
Yes, sir. Thank you for joining us. And this is a finance question. You saw the staff comments in the agenda and the government code section 15201. So this is, my understanding is we're covering some exceptional or extraordinary expenses associated with public defender's office defending a case initiated by the Attorney General. The government code section that you all referenced seems to be talking about, and I didn't really do my due diligence, I confess, on this code section and look at the cases, but it seems to be dealing with homicide cases. Am I wrong?
It's generally used, it's generally applicable to homicide trials. There is a specific Org Code 9300, I think, that speaks to homicide trial funding. But we do think that there's sufficient flexibility to also accommodate the public defender's office needs in Nevada County.
Do we need specific language, though, that somehow references government code section 15201 but makes it particularly applicable, specifically applicable to this case, which is not a homicide case?
Well, the administration believes that the provisional language that accompanies item, the item in the budget bill provides this adequate authority for what we're proposing to do, because there is provisional language also in the budget bill that says that these funds shall be used to pay the county's public defender costs for this case.
And what is this, again, you are more familiar with this code section than I am, but the code section appears to exclude normal salaries and expenses. How does that pertain to this particular situation? Aren't we,
I think,
are we covering normal salaries and expenses? Again, I defer to you all because I'm a recovering lawyer.
I think if you look at this from even outside the perspective of the government code section at issue, that again, the provisional language in the budget bill, we think provides more than sufficient authorization for expending the proposed $393,000 for the county's public defender costs. So we were viewing government code section 15201 as sort of maybe a supplement to this issue, but we think the main authority is going to be in the budget bill.
Okay, well, the staff recommendation is to approve as budgeted, and obviously I was an advocate for this to the extent that we can advocate when it first came up. I just am concerned about the applicability of this 15201 without some modification. Obviously, it seems to me we are covering normal salaries and expenses of public defender personnel, I think, aren't we? And it's not a homicide case, so we're gonna vote it on the vote only, but I'm just asking you to take a look at this and see what adjustment we need to make sure that we can do what we intend to do here, which is to take care of this extraordinary defense expense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we'd be happy to take another look at it. But we do think that the provisional language is going to accompany the funding in the budget bill. It does say that these monies shall be used for Nevada County trial costs for the public defender for the specific trial.
Okay, well, that's okay. You all referenced the government code section.
We did reference that too.
I'm just concerned that it doesn't say what you all think it says, but
yeah,
again,
I really do think that maybe we would have been better served by just saying that the provisional language alone does what we're seeking to do and leaving this out of it.
Well, being a former lawyer, I'm going to keep my mouth shut now. We're going to do the vote only calendar. Thank you for answering my questions.
You're welcome.
Okay, vote only calendar. Is there a motion?
So moved.
It's been moved. Call the roll.
Senator Roth?
Aye.
Senator Nguyen? Senator Pan?
Aye.
2-0.
Okay. Starting at the top of the inning, let's take 0590, Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, issue number 1, California Small Business Development Center. Morning, it's still morning. If you'd identify yourselves for the record, starting with my left, your right. Ma'am?
Chanel Green with GoBiz.
Good morning, Panaraya Abdus, the Chief Deputy Director of the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development.
Good to have you here.
Jesse Torres, I'm the new Deputy Director, Small Business Advocate for the GoBiz office.
Great.
John Fitzpatrick, Finance.
Tamara Johnson, Department of Finance.
Ms. Johnson, good to have you here.
Ryan Weatherford with the Legislative Analyst's Office.
Mr. Weatherford? Okay. Who wants to present?
I will. Thank you. So before you, for your consideration, is a request of $2 million on a one-time allocation basis for fiscal year 15-16 to be used as a match to draw down additional federal funds through the SBA. GoBiz will administer the $2 million through a capital infusion program on a competitive basis that will fund the SBDC's business counseling for capital infusion services statewide. Access to capital remains a critical need for small businesses to operate and expand. The purpose of this grant is to provide one-on-one counseling to help small businesses and entrepreneurs understand and navigate the financing landscape and successfully access the funding they need for their businesses.
Finance, any comments or concerns? LAO?
We have no comment.
Public comment? You all do a nice job. So the staff recommendation to approve the May revision request. Is there a motion? Any questions, Dr. Pan?
So actually, so just looking at the staff comments, so is this, so the one-time appropriation of $2 million, I mean, this is just part of a federal match, or are you getting money from somewhere else for the rest of the federal match, or how's that working out?
We are, 50% of the match is required to be in cash, the other 50 is in-kind contributions. And so the SBDCs do a lot of the fundraising and raise the capital through private funds.
So actually, so how much cash are you trying to match federally? I mean, so sounds like you have this plus you're raising some more, right?
So there's a $2 million gap in what the SBDCs are able to raise to meet that $6 million.
Okay, so actually with the $2 million, you will then have the $6 million
Yes.
in hand.
Yes.
Okay, that's what clarifies. Thank you.
I have one question. Do you know whether or not the small business development centers in the network provide training to small business owners on ADA access requirements for their businesses?
Question. Mr. Chairman, I used to be the chair for the California SBDC Council before taking on this new position, and they may be doing that kind of training. The centers offer within a region over 500 trainings every year, so it's possible. I know they do quite a bit of cover California, so it may be possible. I'm not sure. We can always find out the information for you.
Well, obviously, the recommendation is to approve the request, and I think that's what we're going to be doing here. I just asked because in conjunction with another matter in this building, it's come to my attention that training of particularly small business owners and operators has been rather weak, both at the state level and at the local level with respect to ADA access requirements for public accommodations, restaurants, businesses, theaters.
Absolutely.
And to the extent that your SBDC network provides training, and to the extent that you have any opportunity to involve yourself and provide comment or input, I would ask that you ask the question and provide some input if in fact the training is not being done, because it's an area where small business owners are frequently penalized, and what they often say is they didn't know. And when they say they didn't know, that's the fault of those of us at the state level and those at the local level in government, as well as others. So,
Absolutely.
any further questions? Is there a motion? It's been moved. Please call the roll.
Senator Roth,
Aye.
Senator Nguyen, Senator Pan.
Aye.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Redevelopment Agency Dissolution Local Government Issue 1, RDA Dissolution and Local Government Issues Trailer Bill. Come on down. morning, gentlemen.
Good morning again.
Sir?
Brian Euler, LAO.
Thank you for joining us. Okay, who wants to present? Finance?
Yes, Chris Hill again for the Department of Finance. Since we were last here discussing the the redevelopment agency dissolution trailer bill, we have met with a variety of stakeholders, and we've had the opportunity to consider what we've discussed with the stakeholders, and we have come out with a revised proposal that is now not just RDA related, but also addresses a host of other long-standing issues in the local government arena. So now it's more of just an omnibus local government bill that touches upon RDA and those other issues. I know the committee has a very long agenda, so I won't go into detail on what the bill does on each one of the points, but I'll highlight the significant changes from the proposal we brought to you, last brought to you a few weeks ago. First, whereas the initial bill sought to invalidate certain court rulings regarding the enforceability of contracts or agreements that were reauthorized by oversight boards prior to June 27th, 2012, when AB 1484 took effect, to say that those shall be invalid on a going forward basis. We are no longer seeking to invalidate those court rulings. As a matter of fact, we have stricken that language from the bill. We now say that re-entered agreements are only invalid beginning June 27th, 2012, which was when AB 1484 took effect, to make that fact clear. And we've also sent a letter on May 14th to the 11 entities with whom we were in litigation, notifying them that we will no longer seek to reverse lower court rulings upholding those agreements. So our Attorney General, Deputy Attorneys General are now working with the cities and the counties in question to put those issues to bed, and to put those lawsuits away. Another significant change is that under current law, any bond proceeds issued by an RDA after December 31st of 2010 cannot be expended, colloquially referred to as stranded bond revenues. We now create a tiered structure for expending those stranded bond revenues for successor agencies that have a finding of completion. And if you have a finding of completion, and if you're also engaged in the last and final recognized obligation payment schedule, or ROPS process, you can now expend up to 55% of those bond proceeds if the bonds were issued in January of 2011, all the way down to 30% of bond proceeds issued in June of 2011. So it's sort of a tiered structure that recognizes, takes into consideration when the bonds were issued, and also so it will allow them to expend some but not all, which is a significant improvement over what they have right now, which is they can expend none. We also, under current law, in order to, once you've remitted all the unencumbered cash assets of the former redevelopment agency, the successor agency is eligible to receive a finding of completion. But if for some reason those unexpended assets have already been, those unencumbered assets have been spent by the successor agency or by the city, then that's still an obligation that they have to repay. And right now, you can enter into a payment plan to satisfy that obligation, but if you're in a payment plan, you cannot receive your finding of completion until such time as you abolish the debt. And so we do say that if you're involved in a payment plan, that you can receive a finding of completion, which should provide relief to several dozen agencies. We also have clarification regarding the expenditure of property tax override revenues. An override is where the voters, prior to Proposition 13, authorized a supplemental property tax rate to be levied, and it's usually for payment of pensions for local workers or for state water project related activities. And right now, the successor agencies and the former RDAs, they get an incremental share of that override revenue. And what happens if any revenue is left over after the RDA's debts are paid by the successor agency of the override received by the successor agency, the remainder goes out to all the affected taxing entities. And so what we've done is we've clarified that, number one, if the override revenues were not pledged to payment of RDA debt, then those override revenues shall go in totality to the entity that levied the override. And we also say that to the extent that those override revenues are no longer needed to pay RDA debt, like if you have $100 in override revenues and only $50 are needed to pay RDA debt, the remaining $50 will go back in its totality to the entity that levies the override. instead of the $50 going out to all of the affected taxing entities. We also made a clarification to our language regarding litigation against the state. Right now, current law is interpreted as allowing successor agencies to claim an enforceable obligation for lawsuits challenging the dissolution statutes, and the trailer bill sought to eliminate that altogether. And we say now in the trailer bill that if you are successful in your litigation, that the city can loan the successor agency money to litigate against the state. And if they are successful in their litigation, they get a final court judgment upholding their action, then they can claim an enforceable obligation to get their the loan monies repaid for that litigation. And we also address several longstanding local government issues. First, we end the negative bailout for Stanislaus, Trinity, Plumas, and Lassen counties. And this was an artifact of Proposition 13. It's been in effect for over 35 years now. And this will provide about $7 million in relief to these four counties. We also address an issue in Riverside County where there are four newly incorporated cities that incorporated after the vehicle license fee swap mechanism was put in place. And so these four cities currently do not qualify to receive any vehicle license fee revenue or property tax in lieu of vehicle license fees. And as a consequence, these three of the four cities owe about $24 million to the county for services rendered because they are cities that contract with the county for services. So we have a mechanism in the bill to pay that debt on behalf of the three cities. And what we're going to do is we're going to reduce by $24 million the amount that Riverside County has to pay CAL FIRE for fire services. And the state general fund will then backfill CAL FIRE's budget. And then Riverside County will forgive the debt, the $24 million owed to it by the three cities.
On that point, your control section 26, your May revision talks about four cities, but you only list three in the control section. So I'd ask that you add Eastvale to that control section 26.
We'd be happy to add them, certainly. We did check with the county, and they indicated that Eastvale didn't owe anything, but to the extent that that might change, well, I think we could put them in.
It's a non-economic issue in the county. I think we're relying on the county to assess who owes who what, and then certify to you that whatever debt that is owed is taken care of in order to allow the mechanism to take place, right?
Sure. So I don't think it would be a problem to add Eastvale.
So, talk to me about, I've read some material from the League of California Cities, and I'm sure they're going to come up and talk to us, but under reimbursement agreements, there's some conversation about a previous understanding or agreement, or that if you make 3 required payments, you become eligible for a Department of Finance finding of completion under prior interpretation of the redevelopment agency dissolution process. What does that mean from your perspective?
Right now, if you remit all the unencumbered cash assets of the former RDA, you get your finding of completion. And that gives you certain privileges like the ability to expend unencumbered bond proceeds and certain other things. And right now, it also authorizes you to get repayment of certain loans of money that the city made to the RDA prior to dissolution, because without a finding of completion, those loans are not authorized for repayment at all. And Health and Safety Code section, it's actually in section 34171, subdivision D, it does specify that the loans to the city that qualify for repayment as enforceable obligations are loans of money. And so finance has been interpreting the statutes to say that if you get a finding of completion and you qualify to get your loans repaid that you made to the city, that you can only get repayment of loans that were loans of money. And there were some, we don't know the universe of them, but probably many cities that actually had reimbursement agreements prior to RDA dissolution, wherein the city may have provided services on behalf of the RDA or funded services on behalf of the RDA on sort of a reimbursement basis, but it wasn't a loan of money. And so the reason we've been denying those as enforceable obligations, and the reason why we're trying to make clear in the statute that those are not enforceable obligations, is number one, because again, statute does very clearly say that the definition of a loan that qualifies as an enforceable obligation is a loan of money, not a reimbursement agreement. And number two, we think it's very difficult for the state to have to sit there and determine whether or not a reimbursement agreement was truly for the benefit of the RDA or actually more for the benefit of the city than for the RDA. And we don't want to be put in a position of having to make those sorts of determinations.
What would be the subject of the reimbursement agreement? Are we talking about Public Works putting in a work of improvement that that RDA, an agency, committed to do for a developer as part of a development agreement? or-
It could very well be something of that nature. I think probably the city representatives might be in a better position to give an informed discussion as to what they are. But yes, generally, things of
we'll
that
have that.
nature where, I'm sure they will, where we've done something for you and now we seek repayment.
Well, then, let me jump to the issue of interest rates on loans. That seems to be a bone of contention still. And it's my understanding the issue is whether the interest rate is the rate that was set at the time the loan was put in play, whether it's a variable rate or something else, as opposed to a rate that's set today.
Correct. Right now, statute does say that if you get your finding of completion, you can get your city loans repaid at the local agency investment fund rate. And our interpretation of statute is that that's the LAIF rate that was in effect when the Oversight Board authorized the loan for repayment. And the vast majority of successor agencies have interpreted it that way as well, and that's how they've requested their repayments on their payment schedules. At least one city, Glendale, has interpreted that it actually means the local agency investment fund rate that was operative when the loans were made, which in many cases was several decades ago. And the LAIF rate back then was significantly higher than it is now. Right now, it's about 0.25%, and back in the 70s and 80s, it was, in some cases, almost double digits. So in the trailer bill, we do clarify that it's the local agency investment fund rate that was operative when the loan was authorized for payment by the Oversight Board. But we do also,
So this is different than a commercial transaction where you would set the rate at the time that you made the loan?
well, what happened was these loans were invalidated altogether by the dissolution statutes. ABX 126 said these loans are a dead letter. And so it was our interpretation of legislative intent that what happened when AB 1484 came along several months later to make those loans, again, to resuscitate them, so to speak, that they would be resuscitated and paid at the local agency investment fund rate that was operative when the Oversight Board authorized the loan for repayment after the successor agency received its finding of completion. So we think that any terms or any loan provisions that were operative prior are no longer in effect because they were invalidated when the loans were initially extinguished by ABX 126.
I see. So in other words, the statute takes down existing agreements and then they're rebuilt if they're validated.
And we do actually say in our trailer bill that if you have, that when you go to the annual payment schedule process, you get a 1% rate on your interest rate, which is higher than the current LAIF rate. And then if you go to the last and final payment schedule process, it's 2%. So we do think that's a significant increase over what it is now, which is about 0.25%. And we have heard from several stakeholders out there in the city community that they think that 1% and 2% rates are too low. We've told them that if they would like to come to us with an alternative as to what they think might be more reasonable, we'd be happy to have discussions with them on that.
So are discussions ongoing on that subject?
Discussions, the door's open to discussions, and I think some preliminary discussions may have been held with some people.
There seems to be some issue still having to do with litigation expenses. By the way, seems to me you've made some extraordinary progress on this issue since the last time we had a conversation here, so thank you for doing that. Apparently there's still some issue having to do with litigation expenses, and I understand that if you're successful in your litigation, you're permitted to recover them. But is there any limitation on the recovery?
As long as they are, if the city loans money to the successor agency to litigate against the state, and if they receive a final court judgment supporting their litigation, then they would be able to receive full repayment under our proposal.
Okay, I'll let the league talk to that. That seems to be an issue. A question that I had, apparently these successor agencies are transitioning to a county-wide oversight board at some point?
Correct.
Is that still the case? So what's the rationale for the transfer from local oversight to county?
That was actually enshrined in AB 1484 from 2012, and the idea was that by the time we reached 4 years into the process, because this takes effect next July 2016, that we would have made sufficient progress on determining the universe of enforceable obligations that qualify for repayment, and also most of the property of the successor agent that the successor agency inherited from the RDA would be disposed of or would be on a list for disposal. So the thought process was that we could then move away from having individual oversight boards to just having a countywide oversight board, because there would be less workload for the individual oversight boards to do. But we did hear from some in the successor agency community that, particularly for very large counties, that could be difficult to still have the responsibility for a countywide oversight board over like 40 or more successor agencies, which is why we do have a provision that says in the amended trailer bill that if you have more than 40 successor agencies in your county, that you can have 5 countywide oversight boards.
Does this, so this is programmed anyway. I mean, this is not really a change from the way we understood the redevelopment dissolution process to occur anyway.
Correct. The transition to single countywide oversight boards enshrined in current law, but we are providing a carve-out for counties with more than 40 successor agencies that they can have 5 oversight boards.
Yeah, do you envision this transition from local oversight boards to county oversight boards to change any of the cost associated with this process to individual cities?
No, we don't. There won't be any cost for the cities. There will be some additional costs to staff the countywide oversight board. The trailer bill says that right now the county auditor controller or another county entity will staff the oversight board, the countywide oversight board, or if the auditor controller or the county don't want that responsibility, then they can just consult with finance and select a city to perform that duty. And whoever performs that duty is going to be able to get reimbursement for their costs off the top of the trust funds that pay for the debts of the former RDAs.
And since I always need the comic book version, how does that differ from the way it currently works in terms of cost reimbursement with the local agencies?
Right now, the successor rate, generally oversight board costs, I believe, are going to be funded by the successor agency or typically by the city, most likely the city for whom the oversight. The city runs a successor agency, and the oversight board is going to probably have the costs of Brown Act compliance and putting together agendas, most likely going to be paid by the city. So on the countywide process, the cities will no longer have that cost, actually.
So to the extent there's concern, there might be concern over loss of control.
I think it's more of a
although the cost would be diluted somewhat.
yeah, I really think actually more of the concern we've heard is not so much from the cities, but from the county, that we are going to be provided this big new piece of work that we in some cases don't want to do, which is why we try to provide more flexibility for them to sublet that responsibility to a city or to another county entity, or if necessary, they can even contract out with a legal firm or something for assistance in putting together agendas and complying with the Brown Act.
Okay. LAO, any comments, questions, or concerns?
Just briefly, I think your agenda does a pretty good job of laying out our sort of overarching comments on this issue. So I'll just speak briefly to one of the points that you raised and one of the outstanding issues that's mentioned in your agenda, and that's the interest rates on the successor or the city agency loan agreements. I just wanted to provide a little bit more background. Mr. Hill sort of touched on this issue, that in the initial dissolution statute, these loan agreements were invalidated, and a little bit of the background behind that is there was concern that many of these agreements weren't sort of arm's length transactions, and that they were structured in ways that resulted in, you could say, sort of unreasonably high interest accrual and large payments from the agency to the city. One of the ways that was done was with high interest rates. There were other ways that was done in terms of deferring payments or making interest-only payments, or just in the way that the payments were structured. And so, we're only talking about sort of one of those elements here in terms of the interest rate. And so that's, sort of this background is something to keep in mind when you're thinking about what's the correct interest rate on reinstating this loans. To the extent the legislature still has some concern that some of these loans being reinstated may have been these types of sort of non-armed leaks transaction sort of deals that provided sort of inflated interest payments to the city, then looking at the interest rate and perhaps providing something that's modestly lower than what the variable interest rate at the time back in the 80s or 90s was, may be one way of addressing that concern.
And it's my understanding that there are ongoing conversations surrounding that.
That's correct, right. And I guess I should say, I don't mean to implicate every single city agency agreement. I'm sure there were many that were very valid and arm's length transactions, but I think there were certainly anecdotal evidence of these types of transactions that weren't.
Before we open it up to public comment, support and opposition, Senator Pan, any questions?